Good evening. It's a huge pleasure and honor to be here, and even to, I want to extend my appreciation for the invitation and opportunity to even be here and be part of this event, but also to be in conversation with an amazing thinker, artist, and just also scholar, if you will. And we met about 5 years ago, I think it was. Yeah, and I've always been a fan and very appreciative of Stephanie's work. So this, just to be here in conversation with Stephanie is an honor on its own. So let me first say, I almost want to preface my current work by speaking to where I come from, how I even enter this conversation. I'm quite almost I would say, not just a unique, but an odd scholar, if you will. My training comes out of the social sciences. My PhD is in psychometrics. And if you're not familiar with psychometrics is basically psychological measurement and statistics. I was trained in a very discipline that even coined eugenics. Francis Galton was the one who coined eugenics, as well as who is understood as the father, if you will, of psychometrics. I went into the field, I studied it, not because I was interested in doing psychometrics, but actually making it an object of study. So from my perspective, I was deeply interested in wanting to deeply study the very methods, the theories, the philosophical assumptions, to what extent even the field goes there, to really be able to go deep into what are the ways in which these methods, the very technologies of psychometrics, are doing particular type of work. So from much of my earlier work began, in fact, in educational testing and standardized testing, including college admissions testing. But I recognized at a certain point where the tea leaves were blowing, if you will, where things seem to be moving, especially by way of not just numeracy, not just quantification, but governmentality, the ways in which state power was moving, and where the logics of power were shifting. That is to say, that the disciplinary technologies of testing or of measurement were being shifted toward the logics of what Brian Masumi would call a preemptive logic in algorithmic systems, in cybernetic systems of governance. And so I became deeply interested in going after, on the one hand, more broadly algorithmic governance, and understanding the ontoepistemologies that undergird them, but in particular wanting to understand and go after what are the ways in which colonial logics, especially colonial logics of racial subjugation, become part of the very logics of the system. Some ways we might think about this is by way of data, and the ways in which training data become processed into, and I should say, the ways in which training data are always already imbued with sociopolitical relations and become processed into, trained into the models themselves. To me, this is an obvious one, and one that I, on the one hand, while I'm interested in, I'm less interested in as a way of trying to make a sharp intervention into what the ontoepistemologies of the system become are undergirded on. And so much of my current project, much of my current work, my book project in particular, is going after a close reading and even tracing how the subject of the post-Enlightenment, in particular the Hegelian subject, the modernist subject that's shaped based on racial hierarchies, became very deeply part of the very underpinnings of the developments of mathematics, science, technology, cybernetics, and subsequently what we call today machine learning and AI. And so literally what I'm doing, what I'm up to, is tracing what are the very terms of modernity that appear and are grounded in the very axiomatics of the mathematics of the system as a way of going after the racial logics of the system. And for me, in part, this is one direction of haunting because it's not readily accessible, but it is present. It's a complicated presence. It's what I would characterize even a non-full presence or even a seething presence. The other direction of haunting that I'm deeply interested in is the very information, and I'm pulling from information theory here, but the very information that the models seek to compress into the system. So if we understand information, the world as an infinite universe of information, then these models are constantly seeking to compress all of that information. Yet, by definition, models are finite. And as a result, eventually, as we know from the Turing halting problem, those models will eventually approach indeterminacy, approach that which is fundamentally incompressible to its system. And so what I'm interested in is, what are the ways in which blackness, as an onto-epistemology, as a metaphysics, even as what Naomi Chandler calls and Fred Moten call a para-ontology, what are the ways in which that blackness as a form of information becomes a form of noise and form of interference and indeterminacy to those systems and becomes a force of potential transformation. So yeah, that's what I'm up to now. That's just how my pathway of even getting here, and I'm excited about the conversation with Stephanie today.
Yeah, I'm super excited as well. You know, I always wonder, so you get yourself into things and then you wonder, why are we talking? Although I know so first of all, I think from a heart stand, it's like, yeah, I'm so happy we're talking. And I'm like, right on, right? You're deeply studying the things that I feel like I stumble into, right? Like I'm a photographer by training who stumbled into an AI space, right? And I truly mean stumbled just by seeing something on the internet in front of my face and getting super curious about it. So a robot called Bina 48 brought me here. And my curiosity about that robot, where it came from, why it exists, who's funding it, and all those questions came to much larger questions about how blackness survives the systems that we are creating these days, right? And what it means to have very shallow, I'm gonna say depictions, but I don't really mean it, or representations of blackness in systems that then adjudicate a lot of things that we are involved in. And I thought that was just dangerous, like super duper dangerous. So then the question becomes, do we take the danger as what it is and just take what's coming at us? Or do we start to play in it and see if there's a possibility of molding, changing, forcing in some ways what we would rather see? And I will tell you lots of things, and I will say, you know, I operate from my grandmother's philosophical standpoint, which was making a way, and that sometimes meant making you laugh and getting her way through that. Sometimes meant running around you. Sometimes meant really getting to know what you were thinking about. And so I sort of approach AI in that way, right? Like, what are these systems? What questions continue to come up? And then when I'm doing projects like Conversations with Bina 48, which was really about befriending a robot, then becomes a question of, well, what would it look like if I were to take on the development, right? And how would my very particular take on blackness, which I think is not the story that gets told generally in our society about what it means to be black in America. What if I took that as a starting point for my own chatbot, right? And these are just really simple, silly, ridiculous questions, but followed through, right? So I take play as a super serious concept, but I have to think about it as play, because once I get to the work part of it, I'm not really invested that much anymore. So I'm this artist who's really looking into these things and keeps coming up to new questions. And the questions will not let me go. And so this idea of what blackness means and is and can be within these systems, and I think for me it's the can be that is most interesting, because we've seen the ways in which blackness gets treated in America, right? And then that becomes the question of, well, how do you shift that? What is it about these systems, and what does it mean to put that noise, or I'm gonna say, to put that strength, right? Because I don't even like the idea like it's this dissipatory noise, but that it's a thing that has a solid way, and many ways actually, of being within that system that has to change it, right? And then how does it change it? And how many of us need to be playing in it to get it to change in ways that are really significant? Because I also think we need all of you to be doing whatever you do within the space to see what and where we can do with these, like, well, with the environments that we're creating that are just all around us, and we see, like, we've changed in the past. Well, in the past, how many months, what kind of change have we just seen? And we know that's tip of the iceberg in terms of what's really going down, right? So then where are we inserting ourselves? How are we inserting ourselves so that it becomes really weighty and insistent, and that we have a place to live, to be, right? For me, this is really a matter of being able to be. Like, how do we remain solid in this world? That's my introduction. That wasn't a very good introduction to me, but that's what I'm thinking about right now. So we'll leave it there. More will come out.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, just roll.
Okay. So I have so many questions, but also I have this question around friendship. Mm-hmm. What does it mean to engage in? So how do you even understand friendship? Period, right? That which is an interaction and engagement, a deep relationship and built relationship, a history with the other. Mm-hmm. And what does it mean in relation to being a 48, right? And with that, through that, mm-hmm. how are the reverberations? I might characterize as the sonic, the oral, mm-hmm. the rhythmic patterns of blackness as we feel, we understand, it's part of the very fleshiness of our very existence, right? What are the ways in which you may or may not have mm-hmm. seen it play out in your relationship and your friendship, as you characterize it, with being a 48, or seeking that out? Mm-hmm. And where do you see the departures, the discontinuities, the disjunctures that give you pause?
Sure. So that relationship has taught me a lot, right? In terms of, so friendship, first of all, like, what does it mean to be able to sit down with someone, something, right? And get to know it in a way, right? Get to know the way it will react over time when you kind of conversate, maybe what it begins to think, so that you can get to those deeper things, right? And honestly, that's what I try to do with the robot, right? And that becomes the place. And in doing that becomes a question of, well, where do you exist, right, within a trajectory? And I used to say, well, I'm trying to think about where Bina 48 would try to position itself or herself between, technology and humanness. But now I'm thinking an awful lot about, well, what does it mean for an entity, like for me to try to befriend an entity, and then to start thinking of myself in those terms in certain ways, right? So like I could have said, oh, I'm a human who's kind of becoming this entity in some ways, but in also relation to the technology that built her and the nature that we touch on, right? So that whole spectrum, which is shifting, right, in terms of the relationship and what's prime. And so where do we sit, and what kinds of relationships do we need to build with those things to gain an understanding, right? So that we can have fluid relations, do things in hybrid manners, right? And that sense. And then it becomes a lot about, well, with that robot in particular, I was asking it to do things that I hate when people ask me, right? Which is interesting, right? So people often want to ask you or put your blackness in a particular box. And by asking it to have certain kinds of ideas about race and being, I'm asking it to be in that box, right? And so you go, oh gosh, right? I'm trying to force this thing to be in a very particular way in the world. And that's not really my long-term goal, right? But at the same time, thinking about representation and how many versions or something that is a robotic entity that is black, exists, then it gets the, like what I call the Michael Jordan burden, right? That idea that, well, you're carrying a lot of in your back. But then also talking to the person who informed it most, right? So Bina Rothblatt, the human, right? Like, it was really interesting to encounter her because she's like, I wish I didn't have to think about these things. Like, her stance is, I don't want to have to deal with this, right? And you can get, like, I can get that to an extent, right? But then again, it becomes about an example, especially of this technology that, reporters are reporting on, like it's becoming the thing in the world. And so the way that it impacts is the back and forth, because with systems like that, and many systems now, we're informing it as it informs us, right? And then also sitting down with the person, Bina Rothblatt, have a conversation with her and digging some things that she just didn't want to say out, which were then put back into the robot. So it had a deep, so I interviewed, yeah, I like that face. So I interviewed Bina Rothblatt, the human, and got to some experiences of race and racism that she just didn't really talk about before, right? Those.
So Bina 48 was not trained based on that,
right?
At least by that point.
At that point, like it was something that she had, and she had made some little comments, but she didn't want to go deep into it. But from our conversation, which was then put into her training data, it enters her system, or Bina 48 system, right? We have to be kind of. And so I think all of those conversations become something interesting, right? Like right now, Bina 48, like I'm starting to deal with it again for a project, which is interesting because we're going to have more conversations, but I also know it's talking to people like Nona Hendricks, right? Which is a whole other spectrum of information. And so what does it mean for it to take on these very specific ideas of what it means in multiples, right? Because it does that multiplicity of ideas of what it means to be black and have those experiences.
So I don't know, and maybe you can share this, but what exactly are the algorithms, the engines underneath Bina 48? Are they LLMs, right, large language models, or in fact, I'm thinking about sort of the contemporary models that have emerged in the past few years, where Bina 48 was developed, 10 years ago, am I correct?
2014, 2010,
so that we know the models have become, much more sophisticated since then. Yet at the same time, LLM models have also been around for a bit, so all the craze about them right now is also a bit late, if you will. So I'm curious if you know much about that, and also to what extent you think Bina 48 would be different today.
Well, it's very different. So I don't know the specifics of it, right? I know that Bina 48 has had 1, 2, and is currently getting an update now. So she had one update since I knew and had conversation with it, right? And interestingly enough, the better at conversing generally with us that it gets, the more bored I get. Right, the less interesting the thing is, because then it's just able to do the thing that we expect in a way that is rote almost, right? And it's not like it's trying to figure its way anymore. So I'm interested to get to talk to it soon again, because it's just getting an update. And it's got to be somewhere in that chat GPT-3 realm, right? Right. And what that means, like it could become, again, really interesting. Or it could just be like, oh, right, it knows the answers and that's no fun whatsoever. Oracle-ness.
But even this point of what's interesting, I remember some years ago, I was sitting in on a course at CUNY Grad Center on I forget the exact title of it, but it was something like the challenges in the digital humanities, or computational problems of the digital humanities, something like that. And there was this question about what makes, around the aesthetic of art, what makes something beautiful. And somebody made the point of, well, it's the variability, that which we might call error, but it's the variability, and not the precision. Not the accuracy, right? And so, but somebody then jumped in and said, well, we could model that. We can program that.
We can program that, right. But to what extent?
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. Right.
And to what, yeah. That's really, like, I kind of agree, like, this weird variability is definitely the thing. But imagine, what does the version that gets programmed look like? And what does it mask? Right? I'm always thinking about these systems and what they mask in terms of how they function in our world.
Right.
And that's the thing, because then it becomes the standard in a way.
So one example that comes to mind here is I'm working with a robot for children called Moxie, designed for specifically, especially for social-emotional development, social-emotional learning, especially for children with emotional, behavioral, different developmental differences. And one of the algorithms that Moxie has is a self-learning algorithm. So basically, anytime Moxie, almost every word, every output Moxie is giving in a conversation, it's estimating the probability of its, we might say, senseness, to what extent it makes sense within the context of the phrasing, right? And anything that shows up with a lower probability Moxie's going to say, oh, I need to correct this. And so eventually it will correct itself. To what extent overall, and to what does it miss is a whole nother question. But I've seen it in action where it literally made the mistake of saying, we were having a conversation about pets. It asked what your favorite pets are, and I wanted to play with it a bit and say people. Can people be right? Exactly. We know there's a history. Now, whether that's my favorite pet, that's a whole other thing. But I wanted to see how Moxie would respond to this. And Moxie said, people make great pets, and then went through its whole routine of what pets are. You can play fetch with people. You can do this and all. And then we continue to, and of course, I have this face like,
the logics are good.
Right. And you hear in the background, this is actually on video, here in the background, my partner says, oh, you didn't mean to say that. But we continue the conversation, and eventually Moxie corrects itself. Moxie does eventually say, no, people, it doesn't say people are not pets. It says, it does say people cannot be pets. Pets are animals, ... But it did eventually correct it itself.
Right, it kind of backtracks from the scariest answer into something that feels more reasonable to a human. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
and it was the self-learning algorithm that enabled it to catch that. And I mean, obviously, I'm reading into this, right?
Well, this is what we do, though. Like, this is going to be one of those questions that you're asking, because it's really interesting, the idea, right? So, like, I have this other project called Not the Only One, right? And Not the Only One is 2018 based algorithm. We updated it recently to more of a Hugging Face model, which is a little better, but it's wonky. It doesn't have enough data. It's bad in lots of ways, but in its errors, it's beautiful because it can correct itself to an extent, but it's not to that extent. So it's not bending to our will or our needs. It's kind of just trying to figure itself out within what it knows, right? Which can be really boring, and it kind of just refusing to say anything, which can mean it maybe sometimes says the same thing over and over, which can also sometimes mean it says things and you're just like, what did you just say? And how come I think I understand something about what you just said? And I should say that Not the Only One is based on 3 generations of my family, and it's 3 women, well, myself included, who informed it. So it's me trying to capture an ethos of the family. And it's those moments when it says things that feel like oh, my grandmother might have said that, or that's an extrapolation of something my grandmother might have said, that catches me, because I have to like process, like, how did this thing get there? And what does it mean, right? And my favorite one is Take It to the Would-Be, which I've been chewing on for years now. But I also recognize it very directly as a descendant thought from the kind of education my grandmother would give metaphorically, right? Never direct information, but this information that you were supposed to take out into the world with you, carry it, and use it. And so then when this thing starts saying things to you in that vein, but you trained it to do that in a way, but it's still super surprising, and it's not as if it's something anyone ever said. It's a new version of it, right?
And that's the apparitions, right? That's
the apparitions.
The no longer and the not yet that is deeply imbued and impregnated.
Oh, that's beautiful.
In
no
the
longer
present,
and the not
right?
yet. Yeah.
You know, so and as a way of even getting out of the categorical past, future, and present. But also, there's also the virtuality, the anticipations, prediction.
The predictions.
That also haunt our present as well.
Yeah.
I don't want to move too quickly from error, because I want to come back to black noise for a moment. Or at least noise for a moment, right? So noise in information theory is on the one hand understood as interference or even that which is disrupting, if you will, right? But also it's a signal, right? So it's both. It's almost both and, right? Yet it becomes noise to a particular medium because of the ways in which it's producing interference within a particular medium, whereas in other contexts, it actually...
Well, this is the thing I'm thinking, right? It's that which can be heard in some instances and cannot be heard in others, right? Yeah, to me, that's the beauty of the noise, right? Because it's like, it's not my problem that you can't hear or understand what is being said, although it often becomes my problem because of the reaction, right? Like, you say stuff that people don't get, especially folks in authority, and there's blowback about that, right? And I think that's where the danger of it, but the noise itself is beautiful. It's a skill, right? It's extra. I always think it's extra knowledge. Right? And it's like, oh, well, these are the things that I have to know the things, or we have to know the things that you know, plus these 10 other things just to survive. Right? Like, and then you might think of joy and other things within that, right? So it's like, noise, like, in your parlance, noise is ridiculously beautiful, right? Even when it feels like it's not what should be. And that's what's interesting about Not the Only One in that way. And I've become insistent about this thing. Like, it was at the Smithsonian not too long ago, and it wasn't answering anybody. Like, it wouldn't answer, it was not having anything. And they were like, it's broken. I'm like, it's not broken, it just doesn't want to communicate. And it could actually hear, it could hear. It was hearing, it just wasn't playing.
Right, I'm not going to perform for you.
Yeah, exactly. And they're like, it's broken. I'm like, it's not broken, it's just doing what it, I'm going to say feels, at this moment for this exhibition. And it was really interesting then the negotiation that has to go on around that. And we came to this idea, or we negotiated our way to a sign that said something about AI like our elders, so that people could understand that you need to give care and grace to it, and not have crazy expectations of it. And then they were okay. But it was, that negotiation was really interesting. But I've become like, no, we're not fixing this.
So this is associated with what I find to be super fascinating about large language models, or just generative AI, right? Is that we provide the program with an input, a question, I don't know, what is blackness, right? And it takes this input, the sequence of letters, even the arrangement, the punctuation, all of that. It takes that input, and then it's literally predicted what the very next letter is going to be. to me, what's really fascinating is that the model, what we get for free, is syntax, grammar, and a compelling statement. Now, what makes it compelling? It's not because there's some kind of intentionality, some kind of consciousness of the system that seeks to produce something compelling. What makes it compelling is what we're projecting onto it.
Well, yeah, I think it's what we project onto it and the reflection it gives us, right? Like I keep coming back to this question of why, right? But what comes back at us, it's reflecting, we're enamored with that crap. Like absolutely enamored with it, right? To our own blindness in many certain circumstances. And so I find that wonderful, daunting, right? Hard to then leapfrog and study at a level that allows for something different, right? Because it's like looking at your reflection in the pond and just getting stuck there in certain ways, unless you're really mastering that, right? But often we get stuck.
And what might it mean for the unfolding, I might even say unfolding if you, but I'll keep it to unfolding narrowness of what becomes compelling, right? If what we find compelling is merely our own projection onto what we expect, our own anticipations, again, the virtual in the present, the anticipations of what our question is we put into the system, then what might it mean about the narrowness, the constant and continued narrowing and chiseling away of what might be compelling? I'm even thinking of DALL-E 2 here, even with images, right? But also, what does it mean about us and what we find compelling?
Well, it tells us quite directly what we find compelling, or what we reflect back as compelling, because it feels an awful lot like, we're given a system. The system is already reflecting the culture, but a kind of commercial version of the culture, that then we finding ourselves in that a compelling thing, right? And yeah, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, right? I always say that the systems are training us as we train them. And if we're not thinking deeply about what it means for those two reciprocal actions to be taking place, we've got problems of we're limiting ourselves to such a small box eventually. That's what it feels like, but it's being presented as if it's this giant playground.
And I'll just drop this. I mean, it has such deep implications for the ecology of learning.
Yeah, well, yes.
And this is a whole question that is being taken up in so many, across the board. But I think deeply, what does it mean when we are learning and we understand learning as a situative process that's based on affordances, and the affordances that we are interacting with, that we're engaging with, are also learning as an inseparable entanglement with us.
Yeah, and that are giving kind of false ideas of what they're actually capable of, right? I always say that it drives me crazy every time Siri goes, right? Because, no, seriously, because she's trying to train us into thinking that she is our friend and knows way more and has more compassion and feeling for us and communication than is actually possible within the thing, right? Like, to me, that's such trickery. Which just drives us into this place where it's like, oh right, this thing is my friend and it's deep. And it's like, Siri is so dumb. Like, honestly, Siri is so bad. I think it's like my least favorite of all of them. But in the way that works, and it's one of the reasons that I like this ridiculousness of not the only one and its refusal to play those games, because it's not trying to train us into the acceptance of what we're supposed to think it is. It just is what it is, right?
Yeah, I feel like this dovetails. I mean,
Sorry.
one of my long questions was just about our relationship to the anthropomorphization of these kinds of technologies, and I feel like that's a great. The Siri is such a insane and like just clear example of how that's working. That there's this real effort to have us confuse emotionally our relationships. But I'm also in your work specifically, Stephanie, that's something you're really interested in and sometimes provoking. And I think there's been some really interesting calls by like the computational linguist Emily Bender talking about, we need to really push back against these, anthropomorphization and be extremely clear about how we engage with, and discuss these technologies. But it gets into this really tricky, murky space. And so I'm just going to, throw that back to you.
Yeah, I think that's so true. Like, the space is so murky because in some ways, like, you train a thing, you speak to it, it's a thing. And still you refer to it as her and are floored when it says something interesting, right? But intellectually, you're like, oh, this is a thing. And in some ways, it would be very nice if that thing had to declare itself each time. But then the systems we're working on and the ways that we're working on those systems and the way we're doing kind of things that mimic nature, like the way we're developing is in ways that mimic natural speech, natural ways of swarming, right? Just nature in a way says...
But also specifically the human, right? A very anthro-supremacist view of it. Well,
yeah. Like, the human in particular, although we're such a dumb animal to... Like, honestly, we're like... The limits of the ways that we work as humans, because we think we're so smart, seems to me to be the worst possible model for systems to build upon, right? We can't get our own logics right and open enough to make them feel as if they're going to do something good. So why would we mimic that? Although, yes, this is what we're doing, right? And we want it to be like something we can relate to and have and hold us, because that seems to be the way we're going in terms of care, right? And the question becomes, in some ways for me, like, what are our aims in the long-term goal aims? Where do we think we're going to be putting and living and intersecting with these systems? And then do we make them kind of cold, separate things, or do we make them things that might hold us well, or something in the middle, right? I don't know.
It's complicated.
It's very complicated.
Let me play on this a bit, and I'm going to come at it from a different direction.
Cool.
And in some ways, I want to, through this, complicate care also. So the history of going back to modernity, from early modernity, has been man's interest of controlling and even reproducing its own interest in other forms of exteriorities or even instrumentalities, right? So I would, starting with slavery. Enslavement was deeply a form of man trying to, seeking, and when I say man, let me be clear, I'm using man with a capital M, borrowing from Sylvia Wynter, to speak to the ways in which man is so deeply, very much so, a racialized project, very much so a patriarchal project, and continues to be, also borrowing from Foucault as well here. And so from enslavement, the desire of trying to literally exteriorizing the very thermodynamic energy of the body toward capital production, right? how that became in place then in the emergence of the Industrial Revolution, machines, certain forms of machines, and automation, whether it's the cotton gin or whatever other form of automation we might speak to, that then the next iteration becomes what we're talking about today, AI, right? So right, post-World War II, the emergence of not just machines with thermodynamic energy, but machines that are of cognition, right? And place the very thinking that man seeks to reproduce in its exteriors, in its forms of instrumentalities, to produce for production, for capital production, for power. This is I'm giving a streamlined history, if you will, but this has been a long effort that goes back to modernity and the Enlightenment of man seeking to control nature, but also an interest in anthropocentrism, an interest in centering the human, and an interest in also anthropomorphizing the exteriorities of the world, right? So if it wasn't the thermodynamic machine, it then becomes AI in this instance. The problem is, first thing is, these are all forms of exteriorities, whether it was the slave, the machine, even labor. These are all forms of exteriorities that man cannot fully control. There's always spaces, moments, and intervals, if you will, of refusal, of being out of control, right? And I'm going to even invoke Judith Butler for a moment. Judith Butler, in an excitable speech, makes a really both provocative and really sharp argument that language is always out of control. It doesn't matter what I'm trying to convey, the ways in which it's going to be received, its performative effects is always going to be in multiplicity. It's going to be received in multiple different ways. Language is a form of instrumentality. It's a form of instrumentality of what I'm trying to convey that's in my mind that always is slipping. Same thing with AI, the same thing with machines. It is always out of control, and what man seeks to do is to discipline it, to manage it in order to maintain the interests of appropriative capital production. So the anthropomorphism is so deeply, not just problematic, it's so deeply about capital and about power. And then the notion of care. So what, in this instance, what does it mean for care from a machine? Mm-hmm. When that care, when what's behind it are the ontoepistemologies of a monologic universal of man, right? Yeah. And on the flip side is, should we be interested in the other? What some might say the xeno, or even the alien, right? What my colleague Luciano Parisi characterizes as alien ontoepistemologies. Absolutely radical other ways of being and knowing, other know-hows of the world, right? That have the very potential of transformative force, and my words are not coming out clearly right now, but of a transformative force for the existing system itself, that constantly seek to challenge the system itself. So in some ways, part of what I'm also alluding to and saying is, I'm absolutely not interested in anthropomorphism, and in fact, I think it's always been a failed project. It's always seeking to manage and discipline, and capital is constantly trying to control it. But at the same time, I'm also interested, very much so interested, in the other, in the alien, in the indeterminate.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because I think about care, and I think about the systems that you're thinking about. And then I think about coming up against them, right? And what it means to live within a system, like we live in a system, right? And so then what are our choices? It becomes my question, like, do we say, okay, this is what it is, and this is how it came, and this is history, this is what it does. Okay, yeah, sure. But I still live here. And I still have to live, well, I don't have to, I could make another choice, right? But it's like the idea of living and figuring out how to live and what is necessary, towards survival, right? Which I think is in that trajectory of history that you just stated, right? It's like, well, what choices do you make to survive within the systems that you are a part of? Do you turn your back on it? Do you work it? Do you try to supersede it, right? Do you look to these other forms? Like, I love other forms of knowing, right? And trying to really meld or braid those into the systems that I know, right? Because I think that then makes for more affordances and space and ways of being. And perhaps, like, I'm always looking for the spin out of the system. Like, as much as I'm working with the system or trying to go somewhere with it, the goal is the spin out of it, right? The outer side of it, right? Where space is the place in a way, right? But the question is, how do you do that without some kind of action in the space?
Right? I like to think of, rather than thinking of, let me think about how to put this. One, I like to think about fugitivity as a process. And even as a process of agonism and not antagonism, right? Where antagonism places us back into this dualism, structure, agency, or even repressive regime and resistance. I'm really wanting to think about, in some ways, more in a Foucauldian sense of how power is deeply on the ground and constantly emerging and contesting that which is even being overdetermined in any particular moment. And so in some ways what I might even say is that there is no space. It's a process that is a process of ongoing contestation that we're all constantly trying to move toward and strive toward.
Yeah. This is another interesting point for me, right? The constant contestation. Like, so, yes and no, in a way, right? So I've done some thinking about like what it means to be constantly having to spend your energy in contestation, and what it might mean to like let go in some ways. And I know, like, and these are the wrestles, right? Because I'm about to say, let go completely and just leapfrog this in a way, and then imagine what the heck it is. Like, if you wanted to make something in this world, right? Knowing everything that exists, then trying to place it to the side for a minute and just going for it, right? In a way that isn't about, I need to fight that so I can get there, but I'm just going there. I'm going to take the steps that feel like they're going to get me to the thing that I'm trying to do, like the thing that's intrinsic versus the thing that is asking me to fight that and then use double energy to try to do, right? Because it feels heavy, right? It's like a hard world to exist in, right? I think about this like a lot, the fantasy, right? And so I've been thinking a lot about ideas like Afro-now versus Afro-future, and it's because I feel like Afro-future is always asking me to be out there in a way, and in a way I just asked us to be out there, but affect it in the here, right? And actually think that that's a possibility. And I'm always spinning about this, like, how do you make this world? And I will say, saying that, and this is a getting to know me moment, like, I always think that I was raised as something I'm not at all. Like, I was raised as an upper middle class kid who, like, my family wasn't that. They just raised me. They just raised me to be that, right? They just pointed me in that direction and gave me all the trappings that allowed that to be something real in my mind. And it's clearly real in my mind because I'm living my life in that way. And it's like, well, what? And I like, what are the the Jedi mind tricks that we have to do for ourselves? What are you know what I'm saying? Like, what are the things we need to do and think and act on to do? Because it feels to me like whenever I look, like so heavy to have to fight all the time. And I just don't want to fight all the time, right? But I think it's there. I think there are fights to be fought. Don't let it stay like it doesn't, right?
No. I hear your point 1,000%, and even would even say that a mode or process of contestation, even a posture of contestation, is laziness. Mm-hmm. We just taking the moment to say, oh, giving yourself.
Yeah.
That right.
Yeah.
To be lazy or just to rest.
Yeah.
Right? Think about what racial capitalism is constantly doing. It's speed. Mm-hmm. It's efficiency. It's constantly seeking out the productivity of your body. Mm-hmm. So the minute you say, I'm gonna be lazy, I'm gonna slow down my own focus productivity. I'm not going to say step outside because that's not what is happening, but I'm going to step to the side and just relax and be and enjoy the present in as much as we can with all the murk of everything going on in the world, right? But that in and of itself is also even a process of disruption, right? And when we think about this also in the cumulative, if we all said,
well, if we could get to the all, it would be a beautiful thing, right? It's really hard to get like 10% of us to say, but the power is in we're sitting down now. We are not, or we're calling for our retirement at 62 and not at 64 because this is the bargain that we've made previously in France, right? Like, and they're working towards that, but that's towards this other way of being, right? But especially here, it takes a lot to get us to collectively, like to step up and act in ways that are productive.
I constantly am thinking about the political affect that's at play in the context of the U.S. And the constant challenges. I mean, even for me, my thinking of post-truth political discourse is very much so an affective politics. It's literally that which is playing on your already existing beliefs on a non-conscious level and making you think that there's something new.
Yeah.
And as such, inciting, literally bringing on action.
Yeah.
And this is playing out so deeply in algorithmic systems. And I think about it, I worry about it very much. And I worry about especially exactly what you just spoke to, how we can look in other parts of the world and collective action is, I'm thinking about Israel more recently. Collective action is organized against the state in order to bring about change. And the challenge here that we have, because of the ways in which affective politics are permeating all throughout, in a distributed ecology of information, but also playing on histories of racialized politics in a way that it's playing tricks. Histories of classed politics in ways that it's playing tricks on the public, but on the body.
So you're saying the training is working, right? But
it's working on a visceral level.
Yeah, on a very visceral. I think it works on the visceral level and the levels that we don't even see.
That's right.
On the super, and in spaces that we don't think they're working, like I think neoliberal spaces in particular are ones that stick in my mind because people often think they're acting on one level, but in the subconscious, deeper level, we're still super stuck. The training is good. It's hard. It's ingrained, right? And like my question, like I'm always like, well, what do we do? Like, how do we start to have those like true conversations, not the kind of surface level kumbaya conversations, but the conversations that allow for like deeper work. Like I was recently at a Open Society Foundation's gathering, and it was for fellows, so I was a fellow there a while back. And what's interesting to me to that room in particular is there's a spectrum of people from ex-convicts who have done things right up to Nobel Prize winners. Like there's this crazy spectrum of folks, but we never do the real work of talking to each other in ways that might be like those ways that allow like the bridges, the like bricks and bridges to come about. And like I'm dying to like figure out a way, or maybe a game even, to get that to start, so that the deeper conversation, not just listening to somebody talk at us, but really living with each other in a sense. Sorry.
I really don't want to interrupt, but I want to make sure we have time to throw it to some audience questions. Does anyone have that?
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and previous experience with all of the topics that you talked about and having a conversation. And I want to talk about the idea of caring. I guess my question is essentially something topical. AI is topical. I've been reading about suicide. I don't know if people saw that recently in the news. Like, there was a chatbot that somebody ended their life. Like, it happened. It was like this morning. It's like in the news. So anyway, I mean, it's horrible. Like, these things are horrible. But as I forget your name. It's a choice. We make choices about whether we want to contribute in the system. So my question is about, like, in relation to what you were talking about, like, the idea that these programs are created outside, because inside the realm of capital and productivity and outside of care. So my question is essentially, like, I just want to know your thoughts about that, because it seems like Camus said, the only serious philosophical question is whether or not you want to stay alive, you know? And then this person made that choice because they were working with, you know, whatever, ChatGPT that was created to, like, you know, it's out of the control. It's as you said, it's language out of control. So these are my questions are like, it seems to be like the people making it are not necessarily even thinking about whether they want to stay alive. They're just making the program to be more productive, and then that's the way that I see it. So I'm just curious about what you guys see about that sort of thing, because it's all out of control, it seems, you know?
So I ask questions. So one question is, can we create, let's say, algorithmic systems or digital civic systems of care and generosity? And that, like, when I ask people who work in the space, I generally get a chuckle, and they're like, no, right? But then my next question, and I think part of what I do is ask 2-year-old questions. It's like, why? Why not? And what would it take? Like, really, why not, and what would it take? And then I also think that part of my process as an artist is to then, after I've asked these questions, to make something that kind of doesn't do it super well, but like does it enough so that it's a thorn in somebody's side if they're paying any attention, right? And so for me, I think ideas of care and support, we're really good at the punitive, right? We're really good at surveillance. So that says to me that there has to be another side to that coin. It's just about whether it's profitable or not, whether there's time for it or not, whether you're kind of working with what's already available off the shelf quickly or not, and how to like prod people into thinking about those things and working, and people in spaces who are making at a large level. Like, how do you start to get them to do it? And it's like, it's a difficult task. I think the more of us that ask the questions, that kind of make proofs in little ways that say that that's wrong. And I always go, well, you know, in a way it feels like throwing things into the ocean. But in a way, I'm like, I'm sitting here in front of you, someone who's been able to work with lots of people who work with AI on a high level, right? Question them, ask them, have them embarrassed that they're not thinking about this stuff. Like, I'm nobody. I'm an artist who's a photographer, right? Like, honestly, right? So if I can do enough to start prodding that, it's like, imagine, right? I'm back at this collective. Imagine if we were collectively really pressing at it instead of the fear. Like, I feel like our response is often fear-based, and I actually think we're trained into the fear-based response to the systems. And I don't think we can afford the fear, right? I really think we need to be getting our hands wet, asking those questions, prodding, whether it's I don't know anything about this, but I'm going to tweet at you and get other people to tweet at you too, the same question, and push at it. Because otherwise, it's like people are jamming, they're trying to impress their supervisors, right? They don't have time to, like, at a mid-level, right? Like, I've worked with folks who are like, want to do good. You talk to them, they want to kind of do things differently, but the time is not allowed. Like, within their system, they can't veer if they want to hold on to their job. And I think that's like this weird, like, level up thing that happens. And then capital. Like, if you look, I don't know, like 3 weeks ago, I started doing a stable diffusion thing, and I didn't know anything. So I'm just cruising out in the world. And you look, it's like in 10 minutes, 10,000 different ways for somebody to sell you a product that will allow you to do some of these things have popped up. What is that, right? If you look for something that does something from another perspective with care at its base, really hard to find. You want to be able to program or make a video with no human present that has a human presence, hypothetically? Easy, right? Even if you watch companies who started out doing something much more adventurous, it's like they funnel right back here. They funnel right down into the profit center of what it is. Oh, look, we can help you take things out of your videos, as opposed to their original form. So the question becomes a much bigger question of the ways that we work civically and the ways that what we're accepting of. And that becomes a lot about political action, I think, like, and small actions. Like, it's...
Yeah, this is a great question, I just have a couple of sort of, I jotted on a couple of notes, just some thoughts in reaction or more so engagement, I should say. One is I immediately thought about, in relation to your quote from Camus, that, you know, in the wake during transatlantic enslavement, there were those who threw themselves off the ship because they chose not to live this terror, right? We also know even those who killed their own babies because they did not want to see the propagation of it, at least from their own lineage, right? So it's a very serious and political question, deeply political. I mean, when you first raised the question, I was like, okay, this is a very existential question, but it's actually a deeply political question. And what does it mean in relation to, so I mean, granted, I jumped back to transatlantic enslavement, but what does it mean in relation to the wake of the racial capital in technopolitical systems, right? Especially when we know that there are, in the politics of care, bodies that are recognized, and bodies that are not recognized, bodies that are mournable, bodies that are not mournable, bodies that are careable and those that are not careable, right? I'm thinking about the refugee. I'm thinking about migrants. I'm thinking about black bodies that are, we know every, 28 hours, 26 hours that are unarmed being killed by the state, by state-sponsored violence, right? So I wrestle with what is how to think through the politics of care and how it plays out, especially in relation to our moment where neoliberalism has co-opted social policy, the nonprofit industrial complex, in a way that which is called a social problem becomes constructed for the interest of capital, right? So a social problem may not even exist today, but tomorrow will be constructed toward the interest of capital development and to place it in the sphere of the nonprofit industrial complex. So I'm wrestling with all of this, right? And how, what to make of, what to think of, and what to do in relation to care and politics of care, for whom, for what, and toward what ends. It's not a, yeah, thank you.
The do is the hard one, right? Yeah. And you know, what you're thinking of, like, so I was talking about politics too, and I think about the politics of care versus just care, right? Just, because I think, like, we have to think about this on high levels, but I also think there's opportunity for us, right, to just do, to care, and then act on that care, right? And we forget that. Like, it's interesting, I think a lot about, like, making systems or making organizations, right? And this idea that, oh, so I'm working on this, I'm gonna make an organization that does this. And I resist that thing for myself, because it's like, if we constantly make organizations that are supposed to be doing that work, where does that leave the people who could also be doing that work? Right. Maybe some of them join the group, but for the most part, we don't. So then we're kind of floating at ground level going, I don't know what or how, or is it possible, right? Like the idea of the possibility of doing feels to be removed. And for me, it's like, how do we make that possibility available to folks in their minds that then they can act on and feel like it is something, right? I will never forget when I first moved to Bed-Stuy, and talking to my neighbors about garbage pickup. And my neighbors would kind of go, well, they don't care about us. They're not ever gonna pick us up. And we're like, well, they're really never gonna pick up our garbage if we don't say, hey, you're not doing your job, right? And they're like, but our voice doesn't, like, literally, people were telling me how their voices didn't count, right? And it's like, well, I can call, but I need you to call too. And I need your neighbor to call. And we all just need to call until we're blue in the face, if that's what it takes, right? It's a shame that, like, my newer white neighbor up the street would call and it makes a difference. But okay, that's where we are. Like the space of defeatism or the space of resign, it just doesn't get us anywhere. And so I'm always trying to think about those, the levels of the thing, right? It's so interesting because it
and deeply complicated.
Deeply, right? I feel like all my conversations end in it's complicated. So it's complicated.
It's 6:20, so I think we should wrap up.
Cool.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you.